The story that I have for you today is not one that I directly witnessed, but rather one that was related to me by my uncle Aimé and corroborated by some of my other family members. And it doesn't have to do with Aim himself, although he did actually see some of this stuff go down, and he thought it was very funny, which is why he told us the story. It has to do with his cousin, who would be my cousin as well, just a little bit more distant, Ben, and some of the other family members. So I want to give a little bit of background. We're talking about my adoptive mother's family, the Lemrise family or clan, and there's a lot of them because our great-grandparents had a slew of kids, and those kids, who'd be my grandparents' generation, also had a lot of kids, at least those who weren't in religious life or unable to have kids. And then those kids had a lot of kids. Those are my close cousins in my generation. So anyway, this is in the generation that was my aunts and uncles and effectively second cousins. And there were a couple different branches. My family, the smaller part, is from Aimé and Bibiane. It get a little bit confusing because Aimé is also my uncle's name as well as my grandfather's, and Bibiane is also my aunt's name as well as my grandmother's. And they had four, my two uncles, my aunt, and my mother. And then there was another branch of the family that actually had 8 kids, and Ben was one of the oldest in that bunch. And they all grew up in Chicago on the same block, which was this part of Chicago that had its own church, Saint Jean Baptiste, that was the parish, because almost everybody who lived on that block was either French-Canadian or Menominee Indian, at least in their ancestry. So, my mother, depending on how you look at it, she was the second generation American because her mother came from Quebec and then, became a citizen, or she was a fourth generation American because on my grandfather's side, it would be his grandfather came during the Civil War. So anyway, things are kind of complicated. The important part is that all of these people in my mom's generation, my uncle's generation, my cousins of that bunch generation, all grew up in the same place. They were all very close, all in each other's business. And then as time went on, they started moving out to other places. So a lot of the people in that part of the family ended up moving out to north central Illinois, near to Peru, LaSalle. And this, however, is a story that, as far as I understand, took place before the diaspora out to the various suburbs and other parts of Illinois, and my mother and father going north to Wisconsin. And so it happened in the part of Chicago that they were living in. So they would have been fairly young at the time. And that part of the family, the Aubert-Cecile branch, they were all pretty big and strong. Ben has, and actually so does his brother Claude and Al and even little Mark, have these wrists that are just gigantic, and they're giant people, right? So Ben decided he would save himself a little money. This was kind of a preoccupation in the Lemrise family as well. If you can find a side hustle, a way to make some extra money, take something that somebody else doesn't want and turn it into something that you can, use or give to somebody else or make some money on, you do it, right? Especially that branch, that generation of the family. So Ben got the idea that in order to save on food costs, he would raise a pig. So he went, and he must, lots of people in the family knew farmers. My uncle Hubert used to run a grocery store. He was the great uncle who was sort of like a surrogate father to all sorts of people in the family, along with his wife, Aunt Therese, who I've talked about in other places. So Ben got a piglet, and they had a fairly sizable yard. And, back in the day, there wasn't really that much policing, staying on top of these things within the city and its growing suburbs. So he grew this pig in his yard, and they would feed it the slops and other things as well. I'm sure he wasn't taking it to veterinary appointments or anything along those lines. And the pig, of course, as pigs do, got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And now it was wintertime, and Ben decided it was time to kill and slaughter this pig. So the pig is out in the yard, and they had something like a shed that they were going to do the slaughtering in, and Ben didn't really think this through. What he should have done is taken the pig out of the yard over to where they were going to butcher it, because the pig weighed hundreds of pounds. So they didn't do that. Instead, Ben got a little bit hasty, and he went up to the pig with a pistol, probably a 44 or a 38 or something like that. And, the pig was very tame, so it had no idea what was coming up. And he put it to the pig's head and shot it in the head and, right in the brain and killed it. And then Ben and the other guys who were there suddenly realized, oh, man, we just killed this pig, which weighs more than a bunch of us put together, out in the middle of the yard. And the fact that they shot off a pistol in the city was the least of their problems. Now they had to figure out what to do with literal dead weight, because this thing is now laying on the frozen ground, and of course there's blood and brains everywhere. But they don't really care too much about that. They're going to bleed the pig anyway. But they got to figure out what they're going to do with it. And so they go inside and, they have some drinks and they talk it over and try to figure out what they're going to do. And at some point, according to Aimé, they just decided, we'll figure this out tomorrow. It'll sit outside. The meat's not going to go bad. It's cold. It's winter. It'll freeze. It's just like having a freezer. This is what you do in restaurants and stockyards. You freeze the animal carcasses. So how bad could this possibly be? So these are guys, obviously, who have not thought this through very much. They don't have a lot of experience in butchering entire animals, although they've done lots and lots of jobs. Ben would end up later on becoming a general contractor, pretty cool guy. Everybody in that side of the family is very mechanically inclined and smart in a lot of ways, but also can occasionally do things that are not quite so well thought out. So, long story short, by the time that they figure out what they're going to do with the pig, namely, get it into the shed where they're going to slaughter it, it's frozen stiff. I think they managed to get it into a wheelbarrow, because they were going to try to drag it, and they're like, this thing's too damn heavy. How are we going to do this? So, whether it was a dolly, a wheelbarrow, who knows what they did. But they get it to the shed now, halfway across the yard, and they realize that its flesh is frozen, and that they can't butcher it very easily while it's frozen. They need it to be partly thawed out. So what they do is, and by main force, handling it, there's a pot-bellied stove, a wood stove to heat up this whole shed, and they light a big fire inside of it, so it's getting nice and toasty in there, and the pig is frozen solid now, so you can't even bend its limbs. So they had a chair, and they put the chair close to the stove because you don't want to waste the heat. And they take this gigantic pig, which is several hundred pounds, and they prop it up on the chair, and it looks like it's sitting in the chair, which effectively it is. I mean, pigs don't use chairs typically, but I guess, they could theoretically be trained to do that sort of thing. So the pig is sitting in the chair with its, it's sitting up, and it's got its, front legs out like this, and, its dead face and its back legs not on the ground, but sitting out in front of it on the chair as well. And they're like, oh, okay, it'll just take a little while to thaw this thing. And I forget exactly who Aimé said came to visit. I think it was one of the priests in the family who would be in my grandfather's generation, Father Art Lemrise. And anyway, he comes to check on, the family, and they're like, well, where's Ben? Oh, he's out in the shed with so-and-so. And anyway, he goes out to the shed, and he opens the door, and there's this dead pig sitting there, looking straight at him, stiff as a board, sitting on a chair as if it belongs there. And, if it was Father Art, I'm sure he must have been like, oh my gosh, what is this? What are you people doing? He was not an easy guy to get along with, and had lots of opinions about things, and probably would have said, well, what are you idiots doing, or something along those lines. But, they thought it was very, very funny. And then, they had to figure out, well, what are they going to do with this thing? Somehow, along the line in the story, they also, at some point, there was a bathtub involved. I'm not quite sure what that part of the story was. But long story short, they did end up butchering the pig, but it gets a little bit more screwed up. They didn't really know what they were doing. And because none of them had actually had any lessons in how to do this sort of thing. This is the case for a lot of people in my family, both in that generation and my grandparents' generation, and also some of us in my generation, where we thought we'd kind of learn on the job, we'd figure it out as we went along. And that's great when you have somebody along with you who actually knows what they're doing. So for example, this is a little bit of a digression. My uncle Aimé, great carpenter, did a lot of other sort of crafty things as well. Showed me how to properly put up a stud wall and seal off a basement, and all of that sort of thing. Had I had to do it myself, I could have probably muddled through it, but now, I can actually do pretty good work in that respect, right? He also taught me how to carve wood and how to glaze windows and, things like that. So nobody had taught these guys how to butcher. And what ended up happening is a lot of the meat got cut up, and it's not like it ruined the meat or anything like that, but it was all messed up. What you want are things to be properly cut so that they're identifiable as what cut of meat they are, so you know how to cook them and what to do with them. And from what I heard from Aimé, basically they got one gigantic, well, not gigantic, I guess they just kept feeding meat into it. They got a grinder, and all of it ended up becoming sausage. So kind of not really where you wanted to go when you anticipate getting a piglet and feeding it and taking care of it, and then eventually slaughtering and butchering it. do you really want to turn everything into ground pork? Probably not, but that's what ended up happening with those guys. And that was the end of that story. And they never did it again. They did a lot of other goofy, crazy stuff when it comes to meat and, those sorts of matters. Of course, some of them hunted deer, and, once they moved out to away from the city and into the countryside, and they eventually learned how to slaughter and butcher deer effectively. These guys would also, if they saw a roadkill, they would pick it up and see what meat wasn't totally damaged and turn that into sausage as well. But those are stories for another time. So, and in any case, they were pretty young, way younger than I currently am. I think Aim was probably about my age, which is nearly 55, when he was telling this story about what these guys had done, all the crazy antics that they would get up to when they were younger men and had a lot more energy, but perhaps not quite as much practical wisdom or prudence. And I thought it'd be a fun story to share with all of you, so you could get to know a little bit more about my family. When I say my family, I mean my adoptive family. But one of the cool things, and I'll close with this, is that I and several other children within that large Lemrise family are adopted, and we were never, ever made to feel like we were anything different than the people who were born into the family. And it's a very warm and welcoming group of people, and I really lucked out with being involved with them. But as in every family, not everybody has the same amount of common sense as everybody else. Not criticizing Ben, because I've done all sorts of goofy stuff myself in my lifetime, but I thought it could be a funny story that has stuck with me this entire time, long after Aim himself has passed away.